Hello there, and welcome to episode 10 of the Scot Goes Popcast. My name is James Kelly. Joining me today is Maggie McNeill. Maggie is a popular writer and blogger based on the other side of the Atlantic. Her blog is called The Honest Courtesan and mainly discusses issues relating to sex work because she is herself a semi-retired escort. In particular, she's written a lot about the so-called Nordic model of prostitution law, which criminalizes the clients of sex workers but decriminalizes sex workers themselves. And that's mainly what we're going to talk about today, because on paper, at least, the SNP are committed to introducing something very similar to the Nordic model in Scotland. It's already been introduced in one part of the UK, in Northern Ireland, and also in the Republic of Ireland. So Maggie, thanks for your time today. How are you?
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm doing quite fine. It's a little warm here in Washington State.
That's not a problem we ever have in Scotland. even at this time of year, it's I don't think anybody ever complains about heat, but yeah, it's been quite pleasant weather here as well. So could we start by expanding a little bit on what the Nordic model is and the principles behind it, because a lot of people will never have heard about it before. Basically, it starts from the assumption that all paid sex is a form of male violence against women. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
It basically assumes the way that I like to describe it. It's very similar to statutory rape laws, wherein if a person under the age of consent and a person over the age of consent have sexual contact, it is considered to be the fault of the older person, regardless of what actually happened in the room. Because the younger person is held to be basically the moral inferior, of the older person, that they're not old enough to know better yet. And so therefore their consent is not considered valid. The Nordic model is extremely similar, except all women are considered to be incompetent to give consent when money is involved, and all men are considered to be, basically it's considered to be an exploitation, no matter what the woman says, no matter what the relative age is, no matter anything else.
I mean, so this is curious because it's obviously a kind of sexism. It's sexist in both directions because it sort of criminalizes only one side of the transaction based on gender. And also it's sexist in the sense that it sort of deprives women of their agency. But it comes from a sort of feminist position, doesn't it? Ultimately, this is rooted in radical feminism.
That's what it's called. I personally can't really, I've never been able to wrap my head around calling something that denies women agency and that denies that women have competence. I've never been able to wrap my head around calling that feminism, but it is indeed called feminism. And the people who push it tend to call themselves feminists in general.
Yeah. So having been a sex worker yourself, can you relate in any way to the idea that what you experienced was violence against women?
No. No. Okay. I mean, it's not to say that I've never experienced a bad day at work, so to speak, or that I've never had clients that were awful. And and I have had several occasions very early in my career when I was much younger, wasn't so so wary yet, hadn't learned all the ins and outs. And this would have been in my 30s, by the way, when it would have been my early 30s at the time. So there certainly were bad experiences, but that's not the same as saying that the entire transaction is intrinsically bad. It would be almost like it would be almost as if I had gotten bitten by a dog once, and I concluded that all dogs were violent and dangerous. It simply doesn't work that way. The act itself is not intrinsically violent or intrinsically exploitative, although you certainly could have those things could happen in conjunction with.
But the position of the proponents of this would really be that I suppose it's kind of male oppression. The whole system of this is kind of male oppression of women. It's this wouldn't be happening if men were not the dominant sex, and that women were sort of in a sort of subservient relationship to that. If that wasn't the case, they would say prostitution would just wither away. You don't believe that?
No, it simply isn't true. It's never been. If you look at the cultures in which sex work of all kinds is the most repressed, is the most has the most social stigma, the most violence from the state, it's all the cultures that are the most patriarchal. The less patriarchal a culture tends to be, the less sex work tends to be, oppressed, and the less stigma is attached to it.
It was interesting you say that, because obviously the Nordic model originates in Sweden, and most people would say that's the least patriarchal society on the entire planet. So how would you sort of reconcile that?
I disagree that it's the least patriarchal society on the planet, number one. Number two, a lot of cultures have these sort of you can pretend all you like. You can use all sorts of rhetoric, and the rhetoric serves to disguise reality. One of the reasons for the formation of the Swedish model is that if you look at the history of migration into Europe over the past generation or so, you can see a pattern developing, which is that right after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we had a lot of emigration from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. And of course, this was a cause for concern. People got upset about it, but it was just talk mostly. There wasn't a huge landslide of legislation or action taken. When the Balkans started to have problems in the late 90s, this increased more because a lot of the people who were coming into Western Europe now, they were still largely white, but some of them were Muslim. And that, again, the xenophobia ramped up some. When darker skinned people, when a lot of people from Africa started coming in, that's when the real push, the real idea, oh no, this is all sex trafficking, this is all bad, began. And you have to view the Swedish model as being centered in that, is that basically it's a very racist model. The darker people got, the darker the migrants coming into Sweden got, the more there started being talk about, oh, this is terrible, we have to stop it. And if you even look at things like, one of the perfect examples of this in the Swedish regime was a few years ago. There was an actual case in Sweden where a group of Asian women, I don't recall what their exact nationality, I think they were Japanese, I want to say, but I could be wrong, were kicked out of a bar in Sweden, and the excuse used by the owner was, oh well, they're all those Asian women are prostitutes, and I'm trying to crack down on prostitution. And a Swedish judge actually ruled it was totally okay to discriminate against Asian women as long as you said the excuse was to prevent prostitution. So it's a deeply, deeply racist model from start to finish, and its implementation in every country it's been installed, Ireland, Canada, France, is always very, very racist.
Would I be right in thinking that probably the majority of sex workers, I don't know, in Scotland or probably in Canada, would the majority of them be from other countries? Is that, whether they're trafficked or not, would they be from other countries? I suppose like the perception here would be a lot of Eastern Europeans.
It varies. one thing I think that what happens is the more restrictions have been put on migration, the more you tend to see migrants working in the informal sector, because that's the only way that they can work. When you say to a person, you can't make a living at this, that, or the other thing, that person still has to make a living somehow. And they'll find something outside of the prohibited structure to work at. And so a lot of it's kind of, a few years ago, it was a lot of au pairs, right? People were talking about, how a lot of these au pairs were from other countries, were migrants. And domestic work. In the United States, we have a lot of people working in agricultural labor. So it's all these informal sectors. It's all these sectors where the people are, so to speak, paid under the table, and that you often see. Now, of course, that's an issue of migration law. The more obstacles you put into people working in the formal sector, the more they're going to have to work in the informal sector. And sex work tends to be, for women, one of the most ludicrous, listen to me, that's terrible. One of the most lucrative.
Okay, lucrative.
Ludicrous. One of the most lucrative jobs that you can do in the informal sector.
How would you, you're in the United States, as you mentioned, where I think in most states, sex work is completely illegal, isn't it? Whereas,
yes.
Whereas in Scotland, it's it's theoretically legal, but a lot of the things associated with it are illegal. I mean, how would sort of complete illegality as it works in the US, is that, in your opinion, is that worse or better than the Nordic model?
That's a very tough call.
Okay.
People have asked me that question a number of times. I think the main reason I would consider the Nordic model worse than full criminalization is that it's really, really hard to disguise full criminalization as a good thing. It's hard. Nobody really believes that. I mean, even people who are pro criminalization don't tend to pretend that it is a good thing for the sex worker that it's criminalized. They'll couch it in language like, oh, well, we're protecting neighborhoods, we're protecting families. They'll say, all this sort of thing, but nobody really pretends too much that it's intended to benefit the sex worker herself. And I say herself because, for purposes of this discussion, if you look at the big picture, not all sex workers are women.
Yeah.
There's about 10%, something like 10% of sex workers are men. However, the Nordic model is based in the premise that essentially all sex workers are female, and essentially all clients are male, neither of which is true. But because that's their assumption, that's what I'm speaking to here. So I'm just going to keep assuming, for purposes of this conversation, that sex workers are female and clients are male. But to go back to what I was saying, under the Nordic model, there's a pretense that it is good for women, that it's helpful to women. And we're even told in their propaganda that women in general support this, and that most sex workers are in favor of the Nordic model, and that anybody who claims they're not is not really a sex worker. They're a pimp, or they're somehow profiting from the exploitation of others, or it's the old demonization, right? The only person who would, if you would defend a witch, you must be a witch yourself. That sort of thing.
I mean, as you say, it's presented the Nordic model as, well, I suppose it's like there's criminalization on one side and decriminalization on the other. And the decriminalization element is supposed to benefit the female sex worker and present them as, well, frame them as victims of crime, I suppose.
Yes.
Which would suggest that the authorities should be treating them as victims of crime and should be smothering them with kindness and consideration and so on. But is that actually how it's worked in the countries that have adopted this model?
No.
No, okay.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But just because a sex worker cannot be arrested for specifically, if there's no direct, or like in Scotland, for example, currently right now, under the existing system, technically a woman cannot be prosecuted merely for selling sex, because merely selling sex is not against the law. Yeah. However, she can be arrested for what's called brothel keeping, which really just means maintaining a place. I have an apartment in Seattle that I specifically see clients there. That's what I do there. So under Scottish law, that would be called a brothel, even though I'm the only one who uses it. Sometimes you see in Asia, you'll see the language "one woman brothel," which of course is silly. It's absurd. Yeah, okay. But that's what they call them. So you can be prosecuted for brothel keeping just for having a location in which you see clients. That can be done still under the Swedish model. Those laws don't go away. You can be charged with pimping for helping another sex worker in any way. If you give another sex worker a ride to a call, if you help her, if you contribute to her rent, like say two sex workers work together for safety and to split the rent, that's considered them pimping each other. Anything like this, any kind of giving aid or assistance is viewed as pimping, and therefore sex workers can still be prosecuted under a host of laws. They just can't be prosecuted for the specific act of selling sex. And of course, that's exactly what we see in Sweden. It's what we see in Norway, Iceland, France. It's what we see in Ireland, every country that has the Nordic model. You still see prosecutions of sex workers. They're just not prosecuted for sex work specifically. They're prosecuted for all these ancillary crimes that are around it. And so those who push the Swedish model, and I use that interchangeably with the Nordic model, Swedish model, Nordic, they're the same thing. Those who push it want to pretend otherwise. They say women cannot be prosecuted under it. No, women can't be prosecuted for the specific crime of selling sex. They can still be prosecuted for all sorts of other things, which the cops can essentially invent. On top of that, as if that weren't already bad enough, there's another group of what you might call social penalties, which are not specifically criminal law, but that can be inflicted upon sex workers. One good example is Norway a few years ago had something they called Operation Homeless. That was the actual name the police gave it. Operation Homeless involved sending letters to the landlords of any known sex worker, threatening them with pimping charges if they allowed a sex worker to continue renting their property. Of course, what happened was a lot of sex workers were evicted immediately. So they were rendered homeless, which was what the police were actually trying to do. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think purposefully getting somebody evicted can be viewed as kind or gentle or helpful to them. There's cases of sex workers having their children taken away by the state, sometimes given to abusive husbands, because she's viewed as basically defective. She can't be a good mother because she's a sex worker. There have been girls kicked out of university because they wouldn't stop doing sex work. They have been cases of people actually institutionalized. And there have been cases of women being held by the police for, quote, collecting evidence, close quote, because their body is viewed as a crime scene.
Oh gosh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not counting things like surveillance. How do you catch clients?
Yeah,
You
exactly,
surveil, or sex workers. The Swedish super cop, Simon Hagstrom, who goes around advertising how great the Swedish model is, and he's written a book and everything. His book actually had a picture in it that apparently he was very proud of him sitting on the shoulders of another cop to peek in a sex worker's window to catch her in the act.
Okay.
This is not good for women. This is not helpful to women. This is not decriminalization.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, obviously a significant minority of sex workers are male. And also some clients of sex workers are female. I presume that's quite a small minority, but not non-existent. And obviously the Nordic model simply doesn't recognize that as part of the reality. I mean, how does the law in those countries actually deal with those situations where you might have a male sex worker and a male client? That can't be violence against women, so the basic principle doesn't apply. So how does the law actually apply in that situation, or where there's a female client?
I think I have not seen a lot of data on that. The impression I have, just from what I'm seeing, is that it's largely ignored.
Okay.
Is that it's not part of the model, it's not part of the paradigm. I'm not saying that it's a wonderland for male sex workers with male clients in those regimes. It may be that they harass them in some other way, but they simply don't fit it into the paradigm. They're not going around arresting the clients of male sex workers and calling it violence against women, because obviously if they did that, it would sort of give up it would blow the whole scam, wouldn't it? It would it would violate the rhetoric.
Yeah. One point that proponents of any sort of criminalization, whether it's the Nordic model or just pure criminalization, would make is that somebody like you should not be presenting themselves as a sort of spokesperson for sex workers, because supposedly someone like you is in a tiny minority, a tiny minority of sex workers who have chosen the profession and are happy with it and so on. And that what they would say is that the vast, overwhelming majority, the experience for the vast majority is like a living hell. It's abuse and violence and coercion and trafficking. Do you have any sense of what the real sort of percentages are or proportions of, people who have gone into this profession, well, not as a completely free choice, but as the best option, and they're happy with it within those parameters, and how many actually are coerced and trafficked and so on?
Yeah, that's a good question, James, and I'm glad you phrased it that way, because of course, if we want to define coercion loosely enough, everybody in the world who doesn't have inherited wealth. If you don't have a family tree going back to William the Conqueror, and and family lands, chances are you're gonna have to work one way or another. You're gonna have to do something, and so it's a matter of choosing the option that is the best for you. The least bad option, sometimes. So in sex work, we see that there's a range, just like it is in almost any other profession, right? You've got a small percentage on one side who absolutely sought that work. That's what they wanted to do. They intentionally did that. That was their plan all along. You've got a tiny minority on the other side who are actually coerced, actually violently coerced. Somebody's essentially keeping them under threat, keeping them in bondage of some fashion. You've got a vast majority in the middle who are doing the same thing everybody else does. You pick the best job for you. You like it enough to continue doing it. You may quit later. You may decide to do more. You may decide to do less. It's in that middle. What your question was what percentage are actually coerced?
Yeah.
Coerced in a way that normal people who are not trying to push some agenda would call coerced.
Yeah.
Roughly in the West, for domestic sex workers, that rate is something like 2%. Among migrants, it's a little higher. A study I saw a few years ago in the UK, among migrant sex workers, 5 or 6%, something like that, are coerced. And among underage sex workers, it's 8 to 10%, something like that. So let's just call it, for purposes of to have round numbers, 2% for domestic adult sex workers, 5% for migrant adult sex workers, 10% for underage sex workers. And even when we have coercion, there's something really interesting, which is that if you look at the statistics on domestic violence, you'll see that the fraction of women who report having an abusive or controlling boyfriend is roughly 2%. So if the percentage of sex workers who are coerced is roughly 2%, and the percentage of women in the general population who have a coercive, controlling boyfriend is roughly 2%, why do we think of these things as separate issues? Why do we pretend that the sex work somehow is different, even though all the data we have demonstrates that the vast majority of what are called trafficking situations nowadays are actually domestic violence situations? You'll see the proponents of things like the Nordic model saying things like, oh, these women think the pimp is their boyfriend. No, the pimp is their boyfriend. He's an abusive, controlling boyfriend. He's a bad boyfriend, but he is still a boyfriend. And you're not going to help women by telling them to their faces, no, what you think is reality is not reality. You think that guy's your boyfriend, he's not really your boyfriend. This won't win any kind of cooperation from them. It won't get them to open their eyes. You can't tell a person that their entire reality is not what they think it is and expect they're going to thank you for that. I mean, the modern term for it is gaslighting. It is gaslighting. The only way you can help women in these situations is by offering them, by making resources available, but not forcing those resources upon them. And so we have often said, and you see a lot of sex worker advocates talking about expanding funding for domestic violence shelters and things like that. You make it easier for women to get out of abusive situations, you're going to have more women getting out of abusive situations. If you mischaracterize their situation and intentionally misunderstand them and inflict violence upon them to get them to come around to your way of thinking, that's not going to produce the results you want.
On a sort of similar question, you were saying earlier, like everybody has bad days at the office, and some clients are bad people or violent people. Just in sort of general terms, over your years of experience in the profession, what is like the sort of the profile of like male clients of sex workers? Is it like a sort of representative cross sample of the male population, or are there sort of particular personality types that are more likely to pay for sex?
No, it's across the board.
Okay, right, yeah,
it's everybody. I've had clients who were. I've been a full-time sex worker for 21 years now. I've done it on and off for 36 years, so I have considerable experience.
Yeah, sure.
And in that time, It's everybody. There's not a single profession that I haven't seen somebody from at some point.
Yeah.
The only one thing I can say is that they tend to skew a little older.
Okay.
In my experience, but that's for the simple reason that older men tend to have more money.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
25-year-old guys generally cannot afford my rates.
Okay.
They just can't.
Yeah.
So in other words, those younger guys might be seeing sex workers that are lower priced, but in the escort type sex workers, we tend to be charge higher prices, and so in our field we don't see as many of the younger guys, simply just because, like I said, they just simply can't afford it.
Yeah.
But I used to own an escort service, and I can guarantee you lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of young guys called. It's just when they heard the price, they were like, oh no.
Yeah, sure.
So they were interested. They just couldn't meet the price. I'm sure that things like Asian massage parlors and street workers, who tend to charge a lot less, see a lot younger clientele. And I know that that's certainly and this is purely anecdotal, but my husband, as I call him, my ex-husband, and we're very amicable.
Okay.
He told me that when he was very young, in his 20s, he mostly saw street workers. And then as he got older, he graduated to escorts because, again, he had more money. But as far as personality types, no, and I see no pattern. I mean, some guys are very big personalities, very confident, coming here. Some very shy, very meek, not sure what to say. Some guys are talkative, some are not so talkative. Some are kind of pushy in bed. They know what they want, and boom, that's what they want. Others are very diffident. Others are I don't know, what do you like? What do you want? So it really is a general cross-section of the male population. I've never, if there's a client type, I have never learned to identify.
Okay. Well, this takes us to the heart of the ideology, doesn't it? Because obviously, if it's anybody, if it can be absolutely anybody, that means there's considerable demand from men for prostitution, and that's what the Nordic model ostensibly is trying to tackle. It's trying to reduce demand and either eradicate or reduce prostitution that way. We were talking earlier about how it's, this is not in a perfect world and people sort of live within sort of restricted choices and do the best they can. If we lived in a world where, a sort of utopian world where you could wave a magic wand and make prostitution go away, would that make the world better in your view? No.
And you see, I've written about this before, and there is when a group is embattled, as sex workers are nowadays, there's a tendency among a lot of people in that community who speak out, there's a tendency for them to be, I think, a little apologetic in a sense, and because they're retreating, right? They're in a defensive posture, and so there's a tendency, I think, for a lot of sex workers to give that line of reasoning, that idea that sex work is always a bad thing. I've heard activists say something like, well, maybe in a perfect world we wouldn't have sex work or whatever. I totally disagree with that. Sex work is a positive good. I have always said this. I always will say this. There are so many people in the world who cannot achieve human intimacy in the ways that our culture paints as normal. There are guys who are so shy with women, they simply don't even begin to know how to approach. There are guys who have one or more characteristics that women tend to find unattractive. They're very obese, or they're flat out just ugly, or they're they're old and widowed. There's any number of things that would cause, many women to pass them by. And a lot of times those guys, how are they going to achieve intimacy? Because we all need intimacy. We all want intimacy. This is a very basic human need. And having a way for guys to get that sort of intimacy when they otherwise couldn't is, I think, an important factor. I've known so many men who died. I have a couple of clients, older gentlemen whose wives have died, and they don't want to try to go back into the dating world again.
Yeah,
they don't even know where to start. It's better for them to just make the arrangement and have a person that they can touch and talk to. The two gentlemen I'm talking about, that in my in my own group of clients, most of the time we spent together is spent talking. Very little of it is what traditionally would be called sex, because it's about intimacy. It's not always about the sex. And again, there's so many different kinds of clients, right? There are guys who it is really just the sex.
Yeah.
And there are girls who cater specifically to those guys. I have a friend of mine that I asked her once, she told me, she says, I don't know how you do this, talking to guys thing. Because she herself she's autistic.
Okay.
And so she finds it very difficult to talk to strangers.
Yeah.
So she specializes in what are called quick visits. She specializes in a very short session for a guy who's just looking for sex and no talk. And that's what she specializes in. She makes that available. I couldn't do that. It would make me crazy. I'm a very talkative person. I like talking.
Yeah.
And the guys who see me tend to be talkative guys, because guys who are not talkative would be overwhelmed by my level of loquacious.
So I completely lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
Yeah. I answered the
what I was going to say was, yes. So I think a lot of people would get quite angry actually at what you've just said, because they would say, well, sort of the radical feminists who support the Nordic model would say what you've just described is a male entitlement to sex. They would say that there is no right to sex. I've heard that said quite a few times. Nobody has a right to sex. It's about it's about organic relationships, and if somebody can't form an organic relationship, they shouldn't be having, they shouldn't think they've got a right to sex. How would you respond to that?
Well, I've always thought that was a very, very, very bizarre concept. When I walk into, let's say, a grocery store, if I were entitled to groceries, I would be able to pick up any grocery I wanted and walk out the door without.
Sure.
If a man is entitled to sex, that means that somebody, whoever he's entitled to it from, like the old belief, for example, that men were entitled to sex from their wives. That's what the idea, that he could take it whether she wanted to give it at that moment or not. If men really were entitled to sex, they wouldn't have to pay.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
The point of paying is that he's not entitled.
Okay.
And therefore he has to make it worth somebody's while to give it to him. Because if he were really entitled, he could just, it would be free. It's not free. And the idea that paying for something means you're entitled to it, I think that's very, very, very weird. What I would say, if I had to pick a one-sentence response to those people, is all humans are entitled to make consensual arrangements with other humans that both of those humans find satisfactory.
Yeah.
If a guy is willing to pay me the amount I'm asking, and he's willing to work within the parameters that I set, then I will give him sex. If he's not willing to work within those parameters and not willing to pay me, I'm not going to give it to him. It's that simple. And I say parameters because one of the funny things you also see in prohibitionist cant is the idea that once the man is paid, he can do whatever he likes. That has never been true.
Yeah.
That's not true. That would be like saying, once again, to use an example from another business, that would be like saying, once you pay for your ticket to a movie theater, you have the right to run up and down the aisles screaming, taking other people's popcorn away, taking your clothes off, jumping up in front of the screen. And of course, you don't have that right. Even once you've paid, you still have to follow the rules of the establishment. And once you pay a sex worker that does not give you the right to do whatever the hell you want. And I have kicked guys out before. I have left out calls, when I've gone to see them. I have refused to see guys that were offering the money but wouldn't follow my procedures, whatever they were. For example, I've never seen guys before noon. Not at any point in my career. I don't do it. If a guy says, "Oh, well, the only time I can see you is in the morning," I say, "I'm sorry, you have to find somebody else." Because that's one of my rules. I don't do it. And lots of every sex worker has their own rules. Sometimes those rules are very loose. Sometimes those rules are much stiffer. I've known girls whose rules were so rigid they didn't really make very much money because they didn't see very many people, because not many people could conform to all those rules. But if it works for them, I have nothing to say. Right now, I have a new rule that I just established in January. If you've never seen me before, I'm not going to see you. I am now semi-retired. I only see people who have seen me before. And that's a new rule I just established for semi-retirement.
I found that this issue, the debate over decriminalization or criminalization Nordic model, it's very difficult to speak about this as a man unless you're on one side of the argument. So if I was taking your side of the argument, which I tend to do, it's almost impossible because I'm going to get shot down in flames almost instantaneously. This subject did come up on social media. I think it was about 3 months ago, and there was a chorus of people sort of accusing me of misogyny. And one of the comments that was made, I suppose, is quite typical: is, would you want your daughter to do this?
Of course.
What would your answer to that question be? Would you be happy if your daughter did this?
Well, I wouldn't be happy if my daughter went into politics.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
But lots of daughters go into politics.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be happy if my daughter became a cop. But lots of daughters become cops. I wouldn't be happy if my daughter married an abusive man. But lots of daughters marry abusive men. There's lots and lots of things. I wouldn't want my daughter moving to the far side of the planet so that I could never see her. If my daughter moved to Australia, chances are we'd never get to see each other again. And she's an adult. An adult is an adult. And your children are going to do lots of things when they're adults that you might not like and you might not agree with. I've never been a fan of smoking. But again, if I had a daughter and she became a smoker, there's not much I can say about it. And that's the thing, right? The concept, would you be happy if your daughter did this, is extremely infantilizing. And it tends to be very sexist, because can you think of one case where people say, would you be happy if your son did such and such? Nobody argues against any male pastime or profession or activity by saying, would you be happy if your son did this? It only is applied to women. The idea that women somehow are always children. And of course, at one time in human history, that was the norm, right? A woman went from being the chattel of her father to being the chattel of her husband. And in some societies, if the husband dies, she then becomes the chattel of her sons. She's never an independent person. She's never allowed to just be who she is and be an individual. And we even see this in rhetoric. You see something like people who think of themselves as feminists will say things like, how could you treat a woman like that? She's somebody's daughter. She's somebody's wife, somebody's mother. How about she's somebody?
Yeah.
She's somebody on her own.
Yeah.
Whether or not she's married or her parents are alive or she has any children. You know, I'm not married anymore and I have no children and I'm estranged from my family. So does this make me a non-person?
Yeah.
Because nobody can say that Maggie is somebody's wife, Maggie is somebody's mother. Again, it all goes back to this. I hate to use the phrase double standard because there's so many problems with this phrase, but in this case, let's just go with it.
Yeah.
It's a double standard. Nobody assumes that parents have the right to exercise control over their sons' choices past the age of majority. But yet, here we are talking about women in their 20s and 30s and 40s. Would you be happy if your daughter did this? My goodness. I mean, how, you know, my mother is probably, what is she now? 80, getting close to 80. You know, I can guarantee you she doesn't have any control over her. She has no say-so over what I do.
Yeah.
You know, not at this point. I mean, when I was 15, 16, sure. But that's not the case we're talking about here. We're talking about adults. Because, and you may ask this question at some point, so I'm just going to go ahead and get it out of the way. You know, there's a constant harping on this idea of sex work as being something that very young women do, and that's nonsense. It's purely nonsense. You know, we've heard the propaganda of, oh, the average age is 13. That's completely absurd. I mean, even mathematically, if you look at it, that would mean that for every 18-year-old that got into it, there was a corresponding 8-year-old.
Yeah, sure.
It makes no sense. The word average doesn't mean that. Statistics show us that the average age of entry into sex work is mid-20s, about 25, which of course, when you think about it, makes perfect sense because that's the age at which women are tending to get out on their own. They're out of school. They may have children that they have to provide for. First, by that point. And so yeah, of course, that's when you're going to start seeing the one worldwide correlation that we see over and over again with prostitution is economic need.
Yeah.
Nobody works when they don't need money.
Yeah.
People work when they need money. It's very simple.
Okay, I mean, we talked earlier, I mean, you don't think eradicating prostitution should be an objective, but just hypothetically, if you did think that was the objective and you were in government and you were trying to reduce the number of female sex workers, how would you go about doing that? You wouldn't do it by criminalization. So is the only way really to reduce poverty? Is that the way of tackling it
that's it.
To give women more choices, basically?
Yeah, universal basic income. Universal basic income will be the only way. If you have a society that's wealthy enough to provide every single person with the basic needs, a basic income, enough to get by on, enough to you know, pay a modest rent, enough to buy ordinary food, ordinary clothing, enough to support children, and some kind of a national health type scheme.
Yeah.
You know, so you don't have of that. So a person's basic needs are cared for. And that person, if they wanted to, could choose not to work at all. That would be the only way of reducing sex work, because then you'd have a situation where women who were doing it were the ones who wanted more than the modicum. They wanted more than the basic. They wanted more than the government was providing. They wanted to go above and beyond that. And of course, it would be the same for every other job in the world too. But
yeah, sure.
You know, your big chain grocery stores and such would have and your fast food places would have a lot of trouble finding employees in a society like that. Because who's gonna get yelled at by crazy customers in a fast food place
when you don't have to?
When you don't have to.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't. You know. I mean, my own example is a perfect example. I've reached a point. My house is paid for. I don't have a lot of big expenses anymore. It's one of the reasons I was able to semi-retire.
Yeah.
You know, I'm moving toward the end of my life. I'm in my mid-50s now. I don't need as much money as I used to need when I was younger. And so I have reduced my amount of work, and I did that by simply saying no new customers, because new customers are the most work, because you have to check on them, and you have to talk back and forth to them, and you have to screen them, and find out if they're okay, and you have to go through all this stuff. You have to answer the phone at random times or answer emails, or it's a lot of work. And existing customers, it's not a lot of work at all, because I get a text, I get an email. Hey, Maggie, can I see you in the next couple of weeks? Oh, sure. How would this day work? Yeah, that's good for me. Done.
Yeah.
And I meet him, see him, and the rest of my life is mine. And so my own example, I mean, I don't get an income from the government, but I have my investments, so to speak.
Sure.
And I have my house, and I have, I have enough to get by, not with no work at all, but with less work than I did in my 30s. And so that's the path I've chosen. I've reduced my work because I can. And if you make it to where everybody can, to where everybody has that same situation I have, in a sense, that they are taken care of no matter what, then you're going to see fewer people doing all kinds of work, sex work included.
Okay, so final question. Scotland seems to be at a crossroads with this. The government here is in principle in favour of introducing Nordic model. There's recently been a consultation. It seems to me the questions in that consultation were quite loaded, which tends to be the case. If in your view the Nordic model is not the way forward, what is the way forward? Is it the New Zealand model of full decriminalisation? Yeah. Yes,
that's the one. I mean, that's what the statistics say. There are 3 places in the world that have decriminalization. New Zealand is one, New South Wales is another, and the Northern Territory of Australia recently implemented it, but that was so recent that we have no valid statistics from the Northern Territory yet. However, we have 26 years for New South Wales. They decriminalized in 1995, and we have 18 years from New Zealand, and even the skeptics in those countries, who were truthful skeptics now, I'm not talking about people who call themselves skeptics but really are just opponents, but truthful skeptics, people who actually do look at the data, have had to admit, no, our fears did not materialize. Not only did our fears not materialize, but the situation has proven much better. And in New Zealand, there's an exception that proves the rule. When the decriminalization bill was working its way through the parliament in New Zealand, there was an 11th hour opposition. There was a small block of representatives who basically said, hey, we will only support this decriminalization bill if you say it only applies to New Zealand citizens.
Okay.
And it excludes migrant workers.
Uh-huh.
And so in order to get decrim to go through, they had to agree to that. So in New Zealand does not have perfect decrim because it doesn't apply to
right, okay.
to migrants. And the exception proves the rule because the only problems we've seen in New Zealand since decriminalization are among the migrants.
Uh-huh.
The ones who are not protected by the model
right, okay. Uh-huh.
are the only ones that we see exploitation and problems among. So yeah, the data is overwhelmingly. New Zealand did its own study, its own government study. The Kirby Institute did a study in New South Wales, I want to say about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, where they called the New South Wales sex industry the healthiest sex industry ever studied. And again, it's because of these decriminalization rules. Just a couple of quick examples. There have been several cases in New Zealand where brothel owners tried to pressure workers for sex, which of course is sexual harassment.
Yeah.
And those cases were treated just like sexual harassment cases in any other industry. There were a couple of cases where a client did not heed sex workers' directions. There was a recent case, I just reported on it, I want to say last month, where a client removed the condom and then tried to re-enter, and the girl, told him no, 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 and pushed him away and hit the panic button. He was convicted of rape, which is, of course, the opposite of what the prohibitionists claim.
Yeah.
There was one case in New Zealand where a man tried to short at the sex worker. Some sex workers like to have their money, their fee given to them in an envelope. Like they don't want to actually count the money. They want to just be discreet about it. This guy had put cut paper in the envelope. And the sex worker, some instinct told her to check it surreptitiously. And when she checked it, she saw that it was no actual money. That guy was convicted of rape. So, the model works. The model is doing everything that the Nordic model proponents claim they want.
Yeah.
What it doesn't do is what they really want, which is to stop people from having socially unapproved sex.
Yeah.
They can talk all they want about, they can say, oh, it's violence, or, oh, we really, we're trying to protect women. Those things that's all lies. What they want is to eradicate sex work because they simply don't like it. They're not comfortable with it. And we even see that a lot of Nordic model proponents often have been involved in other sort of anti-sex kind of thing. A lot of them are anti-abortion.
Yeah.
A lot of the groups that are promoting the Nordic model now used to run what were called crisis pregnancy centers, where they try to trick pregnant women to coming in, and then they hit them with all this propaganda about how dangerous abortion is in order to talk them out of it. In the United States, one of the biggest anti-trafficking, as they like to call themselves, really anti-sex work organizations, is Shared Hope International, which is run by Christian fundamentalists. And so, you can, if people were honest about this, they would be able to see, it's pretty clear the connections. It's clear what these people are trying to really accomplish, but nobody wants to call them on their BS.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a million, Maggie, for giving us such a great insight into a really important subject.
Very welcome.
I'm really grateful for your time today. So that was episode 10 of the podcast. Hopefully I'll be back with another episode before long. But in the meantime, keep checking the Scot Goes Pop blog for all the latest polling news and political commentary. Until next time, bye for now.